with different co-sponsors. And I really want to thank our co-sponsors today, Paladin Capital, which has been incredibly generous to our cyber policy program, and the Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative at Duke. We're going to talk for about 50 minutes. We are recording this event. And then at that point in time, we're going to open up for questions. And when we open up for questions, you can either raise your hand in the Zoom tool or you can type your question into chat. If you raise your hand, we'll ask you to unmute and you can ask the question yourself. So I want to kick off by saying how honored we are to have our guest here today. I have been excited about this discussion and talking about the specific area of entrepreneurship, innovation, and venture capital in the cybersecurity area for some time. Christopher Steed is the Chief Investment Officer and Managing Partner at Paladin Capital Group. Mr. Steed joined Paladin in 2008. He currently leads the development and implementation of the firm's multi-stage national security-related investment strategy, particularly in Paladin's global IT and cybersecurity portfolios. He's also responsible for deal sourcing, deal execution, and portfolio company management. He's provided board-level oversight for numerous Paladin portfolio companies. Prior to joining Paladin, Mr. Steed worked in Merrill Lynch's private banking and investment group. And then I don't want to leave out the absolutely most important part of his biography, that he is a Duke University graduate. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, absolutely, David. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and have this conversation. I think there's a lot to talk about on this subject matter.
So Chris, why don't we kick off by you telling us what is Paladin Capital and what's the niche specifically that the company fills?
Sure. So I joined Paladin Capital in 2008 at the height of the financial crisis. And while that was when I really started working for the firm, my actual first foray into the firm was an internship in about 2003. It was right after the firm had gotten started. And I worked directly under a person named General Ken Minahan. He was the 14th director of NSA. And what he first tasked me to do, my very first task at Paladin, was to put together what was a Marshall Plan for post-war Iraq and Afghanistan after the attacks on 9/11. And I learned then, and continues to be imparted on me today, that what Paladin does and the niche that we feel is trying to do something good and then make a buck doing it. And that's good for the country and good for free society. It's make a buck, make a pound, make a euro. And so what does that mean? For us, we've brought together three worlds: national security expertise, subject matter expertise, and then investment expertise, to go and look for those types of products, services, and technologies that can serve dual use functions. And by that, I mean, we look at those products, services, and technologies that have applications inside of both the government sector as well as the commercial sector. We see the vast majority of our returns and the vast majority of the transactions inside of our portfolio companies come from the commercial side of the aisle, though we love to see the benefits of things like non-dilutive financing, revenue diversification, and product validation that comes from that government side of the aisle. And so we explicitly invest at that intersection point between those two worlds. And this comes out of the original founding of the firm, and then the 2 years thereafter. The firm was founded in 2000, 2001, and it was looking at multi-stage opportunistic investments. There were a couple of focus areas, but anything under the sun was something that we could invest in. Then the attacks on 9/11 happened. And it was individuals out of the DoD and the intel community that approached the original founders of Paladin for a homeland security investment thesis, with the core part of that thesis being that because most US and global critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, there therefore needed to be a private sector response to the attacks, bringing best of breed from that government world built with that security-centric mindset over to commercial, and then best of breed from the commercial world built with that commercial mindset of things like ease of use, cost efficiencies, and high levels of scalability over to government. And so again, we explicitly invest at the intersection point between two worlds. Now, we are multi-stage in nature. We have an opportunistic approach to how we look at companies, how we look at the environment, how we look through our dual use lens. Where we more often play are those seed stage companies, those pre-revenue companies, and then those Series A companies, those companies that have generally less than $5 million of revenue. We like to be at the cutting edge of innovation. And a lot of what Paladin defends and a lot of what we invest in preserves that innovation advantage that we believe us, our allies, and then free societies now can access and own. And so we've now been around we're coming up on our 20th year anniversary here, I believe in mid-April. We are on our fifth fund. Again, our focus is on those technologies that bring additional protection to both global critical infrastructure as well as digital infrastructure. Where we started was Homeland Security, looking at any solution under the sun that provided for the homeland. Where we are today is security in the cyber age. How do we defend our digital infrastructure, given that cyberspace touches everything? How do we make sure that we monitor and manage it? And then how do we make sure that we build it with things like safety, security, and trust in mind? And so we're on our fifth fund. We've already put 10 companies we've already put capital to work in what will be 10 companies in just about a month. We intend in investing in another 15 to 20 companies over the life of our fund. And so we are seeing a lot of interesting opportunities come out of the environment. And so again, really, really happy to be here and have this conversation, because a lot of what we're seeing applies to a lot of what we've talked about in the past, David.
There's so much in there to dig into, Chris. I'm really excited about this. I think this idea about protecting free society and the transformation of the opportunity statement that you're talking about, and this idea of, when those of us who did cybersecurity 25 years ago, it was often about cyber criminals and hackers, and then 9/11 happened, and we really started worrying about cyber terrorism to a large degree. People worried about it before, but as a matter of degree, it really changed. I think we may be in an environment right now where we're building on that and actually more worried about defending democracy based on some of the attacks that we've seen recently, particularly what we fear might be nation state attacks. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you're seeing the transformation of that opportunity statement.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're exactly right. I mean, for over 20 years, both nation state and non-state actors, they've used cyberspace to subvert American power, American security, and ultimately the American way of life. And despite numerous criminal indictments, economic sanctions, robust cyber capabilities, and cyber military capabilities, these attacks against the United States and our allies continue. And so a part of what we look at and how we frame the problem really does go back to pre-World War II, when in 1941, FDR gave a speech and talked about the arsenal of democracy. And what he was referring to and what he was trying to express to the American public at that point in time, who was largely against entering the conflict in Europe at that stage, was that we needed to make our industrial systems, we needed to make our commercial operations more robust in a way that, one, can arm our allies in order to stem the tide of the war that was happening in Europe, and then two, you can make a lot of money doing it. So, for instance, the Ford factory was converted from producing cars and vehicles to producing warplanes, and that brought an entire industrial mindset and an entire industrial system to bear in order to solve for what were not just the US's problems, but ultimately free society's problems. And so you fast forward today and you can see examples of this arsenal of democracy in action, where we've got a current situation with coronavirus, where you see the pharmaceutical industry, the genomics industry, the next gen biotech industry coming to bear in order to make sure that everyone becomes vaccinated with the highest efficacy solutions. Logistics comes into play, the military comes into play. It's a whole of society approach to trying to solve these problems. And so we look back to those days of pre-World War II, and once Pearl Harbor happened, and I believe that in cyberspace, Pearl Harbor has not only happened once, but it's happened now multiple times, the most recent being the SolarWinds attack. But we look at that moment as when not only the general public, but society as a whole and all of American levers of power were put towards that war effort. And the great thing about the arsenal of democracy is that it had already been established as a core function of our industrial system in order to arm ourselves and arm our allies. And so we were already ready to engage in that conflict. And so you fast forward to today, and those are a lot of the things that we look at. We've got to bring this private sector into the conversation. We have to connect it with the public sector in a more efficient and seamless way. How do we stimulate investment? How do we bring more dollars, not only out of government ecosystems, but how do we bring more dollars out of the private sector to fund innovation, to protect that innovation advantage that we established going back now 75 years? And that innovation has been democratized around that world. It's now very cheap, it's very easy, and it's very usable in order to acquire these technologies and be able to put them to work. But when you acquire these technologies, you assume a level of trust. And now we're in a space where trust was always assumed, but now we need to confirm it. We need to reestablish it from the ground up. And so as we look at the arsenal of democracy, we look at a whole of society approach to try to solve this problem. It can't just be new technology solutions. It has to be policy solutions. It has to be solutions that bring together public and private partnerships. They have to be geographically agnostic. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is stimulate that environment, and the billions of dollars that have been put into cybersecurity over the last 5 to 10 years are representative of that.
This geographic agnosticism that you're referencing, let's maybe if we can dig into that a little bit. I think we might want to come back and ask some questions around policy and whether we're in an environment where we're really taking the policy approaches that are furthering a whole of society approach to cybersecurity. But maybe we come back to that and first talk about geographic agnosticism. You talked about the need also to protect our allies. I know that Paladin Capital is not just investing in US companies, but this must be a particularly difficult environment particularly when you're investing in dual use companies to determine when is it appropriate or when is it not appropriate to be investing in companies in other countries. Tell us, what's the approach there?
Sure. So this problem in cyberspace that we're experiencing, it's a global problem. It requires global solutions. And so we have offices, we're headquartered in Washington, DC. We've got offices in New York, Silicon Valley, London, and then Luxembourg. And our goal is to try to find the best of breed technologies that can defend critical infrastructure as well as digital infrastructure. And so when we look at the international environment, when you look at a place like, let's say, Estonia, that was the recipient of one of the first both cyber and kinetic attacks against the electricity system. And so, for a country like that to have gone through that in the early 90s and then build upon that an industrial base, a technology base, and an IT base, mainly in the demographics of their population, to be able to develop the types of solutions that could defend against those types of attacks. So as we look at the global ecosystem, most of what we find, is that in the United Kingdom, they are way ahead in terms of the types of technologies that you would find on the continent. Then on the continent, you've got a group of countries like Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Estonia, Romania that have fantastic solutions that really are culturally built and culturally based. And so a lot of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to capture is that global ecosystem of the good guys. Because ultimately, as we see, is the fundamental problem being rooted in an economic problem. You have a situation now where technology, again, is so cheap and so powerful and so easy to acquire and so usable that anybody in the world, whether you're a 16-year-old or a 70-year-old, you can download a do-it-yourself distributed denial of service attack kit for $20, and you can actually take down an entire financial services network. You can do that from anywhere in the world. You can do that anonymously. You can do it cheaply and with high ROI effect. To try to defend against that, you have to spend tens of millions of dollars. And for the most part, when systems get breached, it really does come down to simply a person sitting behind a keyboard not knowing the difference between a phishing attack and a real email, which defeats that entire ROI altogether. And so we have a economic imbalance in what we look at here. And so as we look at the rest of the world, again, we do believe that this is a global problem that requires global solutions. And you look at a country like Israel, their home market is a strong market. They've got a security-centric market. But we always say when we're looking at companies, you've got to not only own your backyard, but you also have to globally scale, because again, this is a global problem. Then you go into a place like Romania. The cost of being able to acquire engineers that are in that ecosystem, IT engineers, is extremely low. And they've got high academic ecosystems, high cybersecurity ecosystems there that we're trying to take advantage of. And so for us, both from trying to do good and spreading good technologies that solve for these problems is a big part of what we're trying to do. At the same time, when we're investing worldwide, we find technologies that are generally at a discount of the valuations that we see in the US. There is so much money going into US cybersecurity companies today that, even for us that does focus on this as heavily as we do for the last 20 years, we pull our hair out sometimes trying to figure out what's the difference between A and B. And so when we do look at these global solutions, we generally get a different cultural mindset, a different set of customer bases, and a different way of thinking about how to solve the problem that we can try to import at a lower cost into the US and hopefully invest in at a lower cost as well.
So, Chris, I'm fascinated by that because, and I loved your comment about, doing good for the world while making not just a dollar, but also a euro or maybe a shekel, and I've always, in my time working at Intel, I spent a lot of time working in Israel and with Israeli companies. And Israel has the history of being startup nation. But I think people don't realize how our venture capital community here in the US is more robust than it is almost anywhere else in the world, even potentially a country like Israel. Do you think there's policy changes that are necessary to spur greater investment? We've really been aided by having a digital infrastructure that takes best of breed hardware, software, services solutions from all around the world. And if we could do that on cybersecurity, it seems like it would be a big benefit. I'm wondering what we need to do to spur more access to capital outside the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think one of the most important things is a really clear and concise strategy that comes both from the US government as well as the private sector industry. One of the things that the current administration is pushing forward, and one of the more critical things that we see is the ability for a Office of the National Cyber Director, the ONCD, to be able to be stood up and focus on 4 critical areas from a cyber policy perspective. The first is cyber deterrence. Second is active cyber defense. The third is offensive cyber actions in support of national cyber defense, and then incident response. And so once the US takes a lead on how to operate in cyberspace in a safe, secure, and trusted way, in a way that also ensures privacy, in a way where you do have both technologists, the business community, as well as those subject matter experts on the policy side of the aisle determining how we resolve conflicts in cyberspace. And most of what we see, is in cyberspace, you really do have conflict that's right below the level of armed conflict. You don't get to that piece, to actually move into kinetic operations is a whole different ball game. Most of what happens in cyberspace, really does occur at the bits and bytes level, trying to disrupt systems, trying to take data and manipulate it in a certain way. and then also looking at trying to manipulate our information infrastructure. And that's where we see a lot of this market going, is that, as a society of a whole, we all want to know the difference between the truth and then something that's false. And that is something that's prevalent around the world. We have been inundated with both falsities, with a lot of truth, a lot of information, a lot of people saying those things, and a lot of bias that's contained in those things. And so that ground truth is a lot of where we see this market going. And the U.S. is in a unique position to take a lead on that. And by way of the Cyber Solarium Commission that produced a report on not only the policy aspects of what we need to do, but the implementation, the recommendations. A lot of what we think and needs to occur, has to be, first, again, a full of society approach. And then next, we need to be able to create a model for how we develop policy around cyberspace. We look at policies not just being cybersecurity centric, because cyberspace touches all these levers of power, our economic levers of power, financial levers of power, industrial levers of power. All of these places and all of these organizations are connected by cyberspace. So it really does take a broader understanding of exactly how we're connected in this hyper-connected ecosystem and what we need to do in order to put the best foot forward. Because again, the cost of acquiring these technologies, the cost of putting new innovation out there is so low that if we hamstring ourselves and hamstring our allies with too much security, we may lose that innovation cycle. And so that's the type of balance that I believe the US and the UK can establish. The NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK, has been a great model. And is one that the Cyber Solarium Commission has, taken a good amount of not only guidance but informative action from. And so there are these coalitions that are forming, and it's not just intelligence coalitions; it's coalitions that want to develop and implement technologies that defend our innovation.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, and particularly mentioned the transformation of the NCSC in the UK. And a lot of people may not know that you're taking functions that were predominantly a signals intelligence community operation over in the UK and making it much more of a publicly facing organization about educating individuals and creating really important relationships on the private sector side to try to bring more assets to bear. And what I hear you saying, which I really love, is this idea that if entities like the UK and the US can show how to other countries how they can make a difference in these areas, that the capital will flow there, but it needs to actually have leadership to create the type of environment that then people are going to invest into. You're mentioning then also the transformation of the problem statement again, and I particularly with the focus on misinformation and disinformation and the insidious effect that it has on democracy. You and I've also talked a lot about the notion of safety and online safety and how that is a new part of the mission and is related to those issues. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's a really powerful way to think about investing in cybersecurity.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I appreciate that segue. When we talk about safety, we do see it as a part of a security function, but not security itself. And the way that we try to describe the technologies that we want to see implemented on the safety and the safety tech side of the aisle are those that really go back to our knitting. It's rapidly modernizing the public safety sector. When you see things like ESINet or other back-end infrastructure that are being established and managed by some of the US's biggest global or biggest carriers, we now acknowledge that most of this infrastructure is now going to become IP based, and that's emergency infrastructure, that's fire departments, it's police departments, it's how to connect into federal law enforcement agencies, it's FEMA, there's a group of safety technologies that are not just looking at solving those physical world problems and those human world problems, but now they're shifting their focus to online safety. If you compromise a piece of data, you manipulate a piece of data, and that data lands, let's say, in a trading algorithm and causes a fluctuation that shouldn't have naturally been there, that's one thing. However, if that data, is interpreted as information that convinces a person to perform a malicious act, because they've seen that again and again and again from multiple different sources, or the cyber effect and the psychological effect of having an entire group of people all vote you thumbs down on an opinion that you have. And so a lot of what we're looking at there are the human to machine interactions. And one of the individuals on our strategic advisory group, Professor Mary Aiken out of Ireland, has been instrumental in trying to push this thesis forward. And look back 5-6 years ago, the types of things that she predicted are now coming to bear. The ability for hackers to tap into our baby monitors, the types of things that keep you up at night as either a parent, or having your identity stolen, those are safety issues. And so whereas we see security as, maybe the security guard that's, holding a weapon, where we see safety is that safety bot that maybe patrols your streets. And is equally transparent to you as it is to the people that are monitoring for safety and security's sake. And so you can tap into that safety bot that's patrolling your streets. You can also see what's going on because it's adopting a see something, say something mentality. And we already see that, with a lot of social media, either video or different types of posts. You can see all of this information that's coming in, and for better or worse, that information is biased. So again, how do you get back to that ground truth of creating persistent situational awareness, not only online but in the real world, in order to ensure the safety and the health of people? And so these are the technologies that we see coming down the pipe here, because the biggest thing that's under attack right now is our information infrastructure. Can we trust what these various sources that we previously 5-10 years ago trusted without question? Can we trust what they're saying? And so we're trying to get back to that level of ground truth, and it really does take a village.
Yeah, and I love the interconnectedness of the issues too, and the opportunity. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't know, you and I know this, and we've talked about it, that the anti-vax information that's been accessible on social media, the single biggest source for anti-vax information on the internet comes from Russia. And it's literally just a misinformation, disinformation campaign to try to get individuals to harm themselves here in the United States. It is safety, but it is disinformation, but it is cybersecurity all at the same time. And it creates this environment where we have government systems, we have critical infrastructure systems, and we have these private sector platforms. And we need to have cybersecurity protections that we can deploy across all of those. And I'm wondering, do you see enough companies right now who can aim at those different markets? The general purpose private sector, the critical infrastructure like the financial systems that you were talking about, and also our critical government systems?
No, there is not enough investment in this, and if you were to look at, the most recent attack by way of SolarWinds, I mean, you truly would need to physically replace each of those systems and those networks in order to rid those systems and those networks of the type of malware that's on them. And so you look at the types of attacks that are happening, not just against our government, they're happening against our commercial sector. And so I, commonly use the analogy, or I commonly use the example, I should say, of a small savings and loan bank in the Midwest. I mean, there is no way that by way of the fact that, they are, let's say, part of the supply chain for certain financial infrastructure, there's no way that they can defend against a nation state attack that targets them because they simply want to get to the bigger prize. And so, we've got to look at those types of solutions that, apply to the broader ecosystem than just the Fortune 1000. And that's a lot of where our investment thesis is shifting, is that, not only does the ecosystem as a whole need more money, but those that can't afford it. Cybersecurity is very expensive. It's a pain in the side for most executives. And in the current day, I mean, every day a new cybersecurity company gets funded, and that's a good thing. But most chief information security officers would tell you that they are tired of going through 600, 700, 800 pitches a year, trying to, again, to figure out what's the difference between A and B. And so, yes, we need more funding, and we also need more funding that focuses on, those solutions that think outside of the box, those solutions that focus on things like data and information security, deterrence solutions, because it's just not working right now to stop our adversaries and those actions that they're taking in the gray zone, that little area right below armed conflict. And public and private partnerships, I mean, they're just crucial in cybersecurity. And so we've seen, a lot of real positive movement in this direction. But the crisis and the problem that's occurring continues to get worse and worse and worse because of that economic problem that we discussed. And so, not only do we need more money focused on innovation centers, but we need more money that is focused on those types of technologies that can breach the gap from commercial to government. And, that's a big part of the problem. Our commercial sector and those cybersecurity defenders in our commercial sector, they're the ones that are on the front lines right now. And they don't have the authority. They don't have the ability to attack back. They don't have the ability to use the best tools that they have in their arsenal, coming from either the gray hat or the black hat world, to be able to stop the problem at the source. And so a lot of what we're looking for, and a lot of what we see from both a policy as well as a technology perspective, that money needs to go towards those solutions that help to defend forward, persistently engage, take the fight out of our networks and put it into their networks. For a lot of this, it really does come down to, what are the rules of war? And defense and resilience is one thing, deterrence is another thing. But we can't let these bad actors continue to infiltrate our networks without repercussions. And again, deterrence in its current state, is important, but we need more of it to really extract the cost of attacking the US and our allies.
Chris, let's go a little deeper into the investment decisions themselves. I know we've got a lot of people here who are interested both in venture capital in general, but also in being entrepreneurs. And we've got a number of folks from our computer science department and students studying in the Pratt School of Engineering who are really interested in being cybersecurity entrepreneurs. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the types of companies that you're seeing that really excite you and want to make you want to have Paladin Capital invest in them?
Sure. Passion is always important. I mean, regardless of whether you're investing in cybersecurity or a consumer-based technology or a marketplace, it's about the passion, and you've got to have a fundamental understanding of, what cyberspace is, what it looks like, the types of assets that can connect to networks, geographic location of those assets, real-time status of those assets. I mean, that's sort of jacks are better to get in the game. But ultimately, what we're looking for is passion. And what I learned very early on back in 2003 when I was an intern is that the biggest casualty of war is the plan. For those entrepreneurs, it's got to be about perseverance. It's not going to work the first time. It's likely not going to work the second time. And so it's those types of individuals that have that vision. They want to solve for that problem because they see that problem as maybe a degradation in our democracy, or they see that problem as a degradation for individuals when it comes to financial losses. And so, it's those types of individuals that we back, and 70% of the deals that we do are ones where we come up with a thesis on our own. We develop that theme, we develop that thesis, and largely, those theses come from the conversations that we have with our strategic advisors and then our group internally. One of the biggest theses that we push is the human element of cybersecurity, where we look at, and this comes by way of an army concept, that every soldier is also a sensor. Well, every employee that touches a keyboard could also be a sensor. See something, say something, almost on steroids in a hyper-connected ecosystem. And so we took the posture that, yeah, maybe it took one person to fall for a phishing attack to say that security awareness training didn't work, into all it takes is one person to report what they see as wrong to prove that that security awareness training actually works. And so you do have this ecosystem of employees and individuals inside of government agencies, that want to adopt best practices, because that applies both at home as well as at the workplace. And so, for us, as we look for those types of entrepreneurs, it's ones that, really understand not only the roots of the problem, but where they want to go in terms of building a platform in and around the themes and the theses that we've developed. And we're not always right, for being mostly a venture capital firm, sometimes we are wrong. But when it comes down to it, when it hits the fan, when things inevitably go wrong, we want to look at those types of entrepreneurs that see this as a partnership. When we invest in that late seed Series A stage, less than $5 million of revenue, we expect that this is going to be a marriage for 7 to 10 years. And so it's people that we want to work together with to try to solve for these problems that continue through thick and thin in order to solve for that big vision statement that they originally drew us in with.
Wow, it's actually a bit surprising for me to hear you say that. And it sounds to me, and it's, I think, very powerful, that you're investing more in people and individual people than you are necessarily in their specific idea, but in people who are going to be able to shape that idea, shape ideas with you to be successful. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think you are. And we talk about it as, both people and engines of innovation. These, the types of individuals that can envision, especially, when you're talking about cybersecurity. And I learned, early on that when you think about cybersecurity, it's not American football, it's actually European football. You're playing offense and defense at the same time, regardless of where the ball is on the field. And so it's those individuals largely, that also know how to attack. They know how to social engineer. They know how to create misinformation and disinformation. And they see the types of societal problems that it can cause, the financial problems, the governmental problems that it can cause, and realize that there need to be solutions to it. And that's generally what we gravitate to is those people, that have experienced it firsthand, really want to solve for that problem. And so, we'll pitch entrepreneurs. We don't invest in companies or technologies or products. We invest in people. But again, that 7 to 10 year time frame from when we initially invest to when we exit a company. I mean, you've got to, in 3 months and sometimes much shorter, determine whether this is somebody that I can work with over the next decade. It's never easy, but when you've got that passion, and you've got that vision and you can model to that, that generally helps to reduce the barriers to success.
So I would think that would actually make some of the nuts and bolts of investing even much harder. But Chris, tell me, I don't do this, so I'm really interested. Like, how do you do valuation in an environment like that when you're investing in people and passion to understand exactly how much that's actually going to be worth and going to develop a return on investment for Paladin?
Well, sure. You've got to sort of separate it into your gut, your heart, and your brain. My gut tells me, yeah, I want to work with this person. Your heart tells you, yeah, this person is really going to help solve this problem that I care deeply about. The logic says I should pay the lowest price possible. And so, when it comes to valuation, it's more of an art than a science. By example, I mean, about 10 years ago, the average Series A capital raise for a cybersecurity company was about $4 to $6 million. Today, that number is the $10 to $15 million range. And so as more money has come into the market, valuations have traditionally now gone up. Where we try to go, again, we try to be thesis driven. think about the themes, think about the things that we've learned from that government and military and intel environment, and try to apply them to commercial sector problems. And so more often than not, we're looking at companies that we spend 6 to 9 months with, developing a business plan, developing a market model, trying to understand and then network them in before we make an investment, to try to help those companies not only give us the diligence that we need, but then leave them in a better place than we found them. Most of our deal flow are filled with individuals that want to do something good and make a buck. And so we always try to enable that, but when we go through our screening process, it's something that we think very carefully about, David.
So let's talk a little bit then after the first investment decision and how we are, the art behind that. But then you've now served on the boards of many of the companies that you have invested in and been an advisor. And you've got people listening right now who they want to be that entrepreneur. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience of being on the board, how it operates with the founders versus the investors, plus the board guidance, and give some advice to these young entrepreneurs about how to manage that process really well to be successful?
Yeah, absolutely. Communication is obviously very, very important. But I always like to say that it's not the company that works for the board, it's the board that works for the company. And we'd like to play well in the sandbox with others. And what that means is we do like to jointly invest with other folks that have similar mindsets to ourselves. And so what we try to do, and what we very explicitly try to do, is create that safe place. Because again, the first casualty of war is going to be the plan. You're not going to hit your numbers more often than not. I mean, it's actually very rare that when a company comes in, we make an investment off of their projections, that they actually hit their numbers in that first quarter. And so we tend to try to create those safe places, because again, we want to create those types of companies that can work through these very difficult issues. These are very complicated technology matters. They're even harder to explain to people. And so for them to succeed, for an entrepreneur to succeed, it is about that partnership. It's creating that place where they can come in and try to diagnose a problem that's going to be coming in the future, not a problem that's happening today. And so most of our time is spent on things like strategic development, looking at these assets, very early stage assets, from a corporate development and a business development standpoint, taking that operational burden off of their shoulders, helping them with dual use. The vast majority of companies, 9 out of 10 companies that come from the commercial side of the aisle to us and ask us, can you get us into government? I tell them no, not until you can get to $5 to $10 million of revenue. If you're just focused on commercial right now, keep focusing on commercial. Those sales cycles are 6 to 12 months. Sales cycles inside of government could be 2 to 3 years. And so it doesn't make sense for an early stage company to be able to facilitate that government customer when they're only raising money for 12 to 18 months at a time, when it takes 2 to 3 years to get that procurement. And so a lot of what we try to do from my board perspective is, again, create that safe place so you can allow them to fail, and then focus on, the goal of trying to build the business and obviously create a return, but also filling that gap, where they're not going to have the expertise more often than not to go to government. And so we try to lower that barrier. We try to be able to network them into the right places. So instead of knocking on 20 doors, they're knocking on 4 or 5 doors, only one of which may work out, but that could be worth its weight in gold. And so, for us, it's a lot about collaboration. And again, things are going to go wrong, and it's how you work through that problem solving set of exercises that really defines the type of entrepreneurs that are successful.
So, and I've got a couple more questions, and then we'll open up for audience questions. So if people want to ask a question, if you want to raise your hand or put something in the chat, and I'll start a queue. But Chris, I want to come back to the role of serving on the boards. I've served on several boards myself, and I've always found it to be an interesting mix of different roles when I'm serving on a board. There is the guidance part of the role of being on the board. There can be an oversight role of serving on the board. And then there's the role of providing connections and other resources and connecting the entity to other entities that could potentially be helpful. I think one of the things that I find most fascinating about Paladin is the partners that you have. You described, and I'm incredibly jealous about this and want to hear more stories about being able to be an intern for General Minahan. And it's not just General Minahan, you guys have a number of other advisors who were very influential, the leading lights in government cybersecurity work. Can you talk a little bit more about how that conversation works with your advisors and with senior officials in the government when those companies you're serving on the board are ready to start talking to the government about making their solution a dual use solution?
Oh, that's a great question. And we enjoy, I mean, a very, very robust relationship with the group around our table. And part of that, again, goes to our original thesis. You got to do something good for the country, make a buck doing it, do something good for free society. A lot of these individuals that are on our strategic advisory group, it's not about making the money, it's serving the mission. And so we partly feel like at Paladin that we're helping to serve the mission. And so when we sit down, what we're looking for is not access. We're not looking for government contracts. We're not looking for ways into certain doors that are hard to access for others that don't have these connections. What we're looking to do is try to collaborate, because if this is the model that we want to push out there, it has to be a conversation, between individuals that come out of the DoD and the government and the defense community, or excuse me, the intel community, as well as the private sector. The private sector, I mean, most publicly traded companies, I mean, not most, all publicly traded companies have to generate a profit, or else they're not going to be publicly traded anymore. They're going to get acquired. They're going to go away. Whereas the government can spend endless amounts of money in the highest tech solutions. And so you've got this disparity between these two worlds. And that's where we try to fill that gap. We very explicitly invest at that intersection point between those two ecosystems. And so where, a concept like an army concept where every soldier is a sensor, how does that translate into cybersecurity? That takes years and years of scouring the environment and trying to understand what we should be looking for. We've actually got a practice in things like digital biology, that are inherently dual use, inherently pull upon those security in the cyber age concepts, where we're informed and we follow the breadcrumbs into ecosystems where massive amounts of government dollars have been spent on these technologies for maybe just one use case and one government customer. And so trying to spin those technologies out into the commercial world, being patient with those technologies, utilizing those government contacts to help expend the lives of these companies that we invest in so that they don't have to go get other equity dollars. They don't have to take on debt. They don't have to worry about what their balance sheet is going to look like because they do have that extra little piece. And so, I mean, much of what I'm describing today has been informed by 13, 14 years of conversations. And then the original entree into Paladin in 2002, 2003, as you described. I mean, being able to intern with individuals like General Ken Minahan or Alvin Drayson or Jim Woolsey, Chris Inglis. I mean, these are the type of individuals that we butt heads with, we collaborate with, we talk to, and we want to find that unified solution to this big problem. And it does take, the public and private sector, it does take these hard conversations. And so, when it comes to the tactical piece, of course, we try to introduce our companies to customers. We try to bring executives into the companies in order to help them grow. We'll help them connect anywhere we want or anywhere that they want to connect to. But at the end of the day, most entrepreneurs come with us because of those conversations, because we walk up to them with a theme and a thesis that they've long been thinking about on their own and think that they may be the only ones that have it. And so that's what we love is that light bulb moment when you connect with somebody and realize, oh my gosh, we've been both thinking about this for the last X number of months and years. And here we are in the perfect storm situation to potentially make an investment and solve for a serious problem.
It's great. And, I think that's where you really see, it's almost as if we come full circle to the way we started. talking about how that public-private partnership then can build better solutions that are actually going to help attack this pretty huge problem that we've got right now. I've already got a queue of questions, a bunch of students who have questions for you, Chris, and I want to start with Niharika. Niharika, if you want to take yourself off mute to ask Chris a question.
Great. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm in Professor Hoffman's class and very interested in finance. I was hoping to learn a little bit more about sort of the flip side in the due diligence process. Are there ever any aspects of an early stage venture, especially with the tech itself, that would raise what you might consider red flags in the due diligence process?
Yeah, sure. Issues around IP, are generally the things that we worry about first. Especially for an entrepreneur that's coming out of a large cybersecurity organization, a publicly traded firm. They came up with an idea. We need to evaluate the technology. But what it really comes down to for us, when the biggest red flags go up, are those when a company will come in or a technology will come in that professes to solve for 99.999% of the problems. If that was the case and every company was doing that, and 7 out of 10 companies that walk through our door profess that they're doing that, then the problem would be getting better, but it's actually getting much worse. And so it generally is a red flag when we hear about these silver bullet solutions, or we hear about solutions that, because it's cybersecurity, even though it's pre-revenue, because they've got A, B, C, D, and E around the table, they believe that they're valued at $300, $400 million. Those are really hard conversations to have, especially when you're interested in their technology. And so it generally comes down to, the acknowledgement of what they have and where they want to go, and then trying to fit in with us. We've got a very explicit investment thesis, focusing on that intersection point between those two worlds. And we will say to entrepreneurs up front, if you don't want to work with us, we're not overbearing, we're not going to get into your day-to-day operations, but if you don't want our help, then this is likely not a partnership that we want to engage in with you. And so we look really hard at those types of things when we evaluate a company. But red flags, it really is by way of perception, and by way of the themes and the theses that we're investing through.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Ali.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. My question was that the way you describe Paladin Capital, it seems that the firm is pretty vertically specialized, especially in like cybersecurity with this latest Paladin Cyber Fund. But some of the most successful VC funds recently, such as Sequoia or A16Z or Kleiner Perkins, are generalists. So I'd like to ask you if you think one approach is inherently better than the other, and if you would wish that more funds would be specialized in any specific vertical, like cybersecurity, or just in any vertical in particular, if you'd like to see more specialization in the VC world.
Yeah, you do need both. And for a lot of our co-investors, the people that follow us into deals, are those bigger funds that are generalists. And that is many times with the companies that we invest in, the goal that we're going to invest in you now. In 18 to 24 months, we're going to set you up with a process that puts you in front of some of the best and the brightest in the world from a venture capital perspective. And so there does need to be more specialization from a venture investment perspective. There's a lot of folks that are focused on this space. There needs to be more. At the same time, we also acknowledge that you do need to see some level of consolidation begin to occur in order to keep the flow of capital coming in. And that level of consolidation can only occur by way of those additional dollars that come from those generalists that are willing to pay on the way up. And so for us, as we look at our target ecosystem, cybersecurity is a huge part of what we do. But you have to have that mindset of dual use that applies itself to not just cybersecurity, but other national security problems. Security in the cyber age, words are important. We look at the world through that security in the cyber age, and so much of that is cybersecurity, but other areas we look at and have an investment in a company called Ursa Space Systems that takes synthetic aperture radar satellites, and it creates a common operating picture to facilitate persistent awareness over areas of interest. So if you want to watch a parking lot and see how many cars are coming into it in order to predict how many shoppers may be going into a Walmart, let's say, and do so across many different satellite constellations at the same time, this is the type of company you go to. Well, this is a company that takes cyberspace basic principles. This is something that has to have security and trust inherently built in. Same thing with digital biology. And so, while cybersecurity is absolutely important, it itself alone is not critical. If you're not building autonomous systems, IoT, or what have you, with safety, security, and trust in mind, you're ultimately leading yourself to a scalability problem or a scalability risk in the future. And so, again, we see this entire life cycle approach of digital adoption that many of these organizations are going through, where they want to enable themselves to be digital. They want to get the benefits of the additional revenue. They want to cut costs. They want higher levels of confidence over their mission assurance goals, but they tend to adopt technologies faster than their ability to risk manage them.
Thank you.
Lucy.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for speaking with us tonight. I want to go back to something we discussed earlier about like collaboration internationally, but also between the public and private sectors, especially in relationship to COVID. We've seen them come together to collaborate on a vaccine. I was wondering if we've seen any collaboration to protect the vaccine data that we have gathered, especially after the attack that happened in Europe.
Yeah, and it's a really timely question, and we are looking at a set of companies, and we look at some of the reactions that we have seen to the vaccination rollout, and I'll use an analogy, I'll use an example in order to answer the question. It was back in the early 80s when we first started to see misinformation and disinformation around the AIDS virus. We knew it was out there, and from a science perspective, we didn't really know what it was yet. However, misinformation about it was actually coming out, that it was something that was developed nefariously inside government labs and intentionally introduced into society. That was called Operation Infection. And what that was a Russian disinformation and misinformation campaign to integrate into people's minds. And that rumor, that misinformation still exists today, that HIV was, from a conspiracy perspective, a government developed virus that was then unleashed on individual groups of people, individual demographics. And so you fast forward today, and a lot of what we observed is described as Operation Infection 2, where you're trying to dissuade individuals from getting the vaccine, or you're trying to create a level of misinformation around that. And so we're seeing a new set of companies that are cropping up that are, one, going after hot pursuits. So if somebody comes in and steals your IP around a vaccine, you want to be able to stop them in the act, you want to be able to recover it, and you want to be able to create campaigns that stop that misinformation that they'll create off of it from continuing to percolate. And at the same time, we are also looking at privacy solutions, GDPR from out of the EU, CCPA, the privacy solution out of California, which I think will be a model for much of the United States. Those types of solutions, I think, are going to help significantly solve this problem, because it is not just a cybersecurity problem. I mean, this is one that does touch people. This is a safety problem. This is a human health issue. And so you can't just deal with it as bits and bytes. You've got to get down to ground truth. And so we're seeing instances of this more and more. And it's something that gives us pause, something that we're now focused on. And we've seen a history of this occurring, and we're now seeing this again. Operation Infection back in the 80s, Operation Infection 2 in our current day.
Thank you.
And Chris, that was fascinating. And I just want to, we've got more folks lined up, but I want to come in with a question real quick to follow up on that. Your mention of GDPR and CCPA and some of your comments earlier, you and I haven't talked about this much, but it seems like what you're saying is that regulation and or legislation, when done right, can actually incentivize investment to help solve the problem and maybe be a bit of a market maker. Am I hearing you correctly on that?
100%. And it's, governance, it's compliance, it's best practices. And whereas, cyber and cybersecurity, those types of technologies, they were nice to have in the early 2000s. Then they became, a need to have. I've got to do this in order to compete. Now, they are mandated to have these solutions. If you don't have them, you are not going to succeed. And that's both from a compliance and a governance perspective. You're going to get fined or worse. And you're not going to be able to compete in this hyper-connected ecosystem that is cyberspace. And so if you don't have the proper protections in place as mandated by these solutions, you're simply not going to survive. And so, it is, one of those ROI mindsets where, you spend $1 now, you save yourself $70 later on when the problem goes wrong. And so, yes, I do believe that, what has come out of the Cyber Solarium Commission, what things like NCSC have established, GDPR, the new regulations that we're going to see around privacy in the UK, what have you. I think it's not only going to drive a lot of innovation, but it's going to drive a lot of investment. And those types of solutions, not only are sold to chief information security officers, they're sold to people that are division leads on the business side of the aisle, because if they don't do it right, they're not going to get any business.
This is great, because it's one of the things we talk about a lot in class are the different mechanisms that public policy can use to affect change and make an impact. And one of them can be to create opportunities, investment, and spur innovation. And it can come through things like GDPR and CCPA. But we could talk about that for a long time, but I want to make sure to continue to get to student questions. Kaylee?
Hi, thanks for being here today. I think this is a good segue into my question, which is more focused on when things go wrong. And you highlighted that one of the critical areas we should focus on in policy is incident response. And I think before we have a response, we need to identify an incident. And so I'm just wondering if you think that the private sector is hesitant to report incidents because it can be detrimental to their business and trust. And if so, how do we, through policy, incentivize companies to be transparent when there's a security breach and then provide them the protection they need following that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of answers to that question. So, if you're a publicly traded company, you're under a compliance mandate with both FINRA and the SEC in order to report substantial cyber breaches. How that's defined, is variable. It's something that we want to see standards around. But when it comes to incident response, the biggest thing that we see as having an effect is reducing the time between, when you realize something might be wrong and then when you get to your remediation point. And so we're seeing now a lot of integrated solutions that can come along and say, rather than buying, 10 of these different technologies, one that sits on your endpoint, one that sits at your network level, one that is a reporting tool for your board, you're looking at these unified solutions, some of which, if not the majority of which in the future, are going to be operated as managed services. Where, hey, look, I can't possibly, with the amount of money that I have or the sophistication of my networks that are currently in place, can bring in the best talent in the world. So I've got to outsource this. And so, from that perspective, when things do go wrong, how quickly you get to that remediation point is important. But what we're trying to get to, from a policy perspective, is understanding, what's going on behaviorally with a commonly known attacker before that attacker targets your organization. And there's a combination of technologies. It's not just monitoring your attacker. It's actually performing red teaming services, penetration testing services. You want to attack yourself as much as possible in every way as possible to try to figure out how the bad guys get in, because they will inevitably get in. and they're going to get in through one of your gaps that you're just not going to be able to cover. And so how quickly you can remediate from that, how quickly you can call up your PR people, how quickly you've done your tabletop exercises and then applied them to this situation, that is immensely important. And so, yeah, there should be more on the private side. Public companies, they do have those compliant matters, but on the private side, we're even beginning to write into our deals a certain set of mandates that they must adopt a set of best practices that fall above a cybersecurity poverty line rather than below. Because we do believe in the future that there are going to be a lot of companies in that global supply chain that are just not going to be able to put those best practices into place. And because they can't, they're not going to be able to participate because their systems will be seen as inherently weaker. And so that's a lot of what we focus on around this, and there does need to be more around mandatory requirements for, for these types of attacks and these breaches. But it's incumbent upon people like us sitting on the boards and with our investment dollars on the private side to enforce that.
Chris, do you think that's going to intensify after SolarWinds and all the publicity that SolarWinds got for itself not having adequate cybersecurity processes and structures?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Within weeks of the announcement, we had asked almost every one of our portfolio companies, do they or anyone in their supply chain, software or otherwise, utilize SolarWinds as part of their infrastructure. And so from us, from a board level, looking at something like that and mandating that if you do, you need to risk manage this and immediately go into incident response mode, is something that we try to implement at that board level. And we, sometimes can uniquely do that. We actually got a call from a company the other day that had said that its payment operator had been breached and had been submitting to this company tens, if not hundreds, of requests for employee benefits, or excuse me, for out of employment benefits. And most of the employees that were submitting those out of employment benefits were still employed by the company. And so we continue to see these, operational efficiencies getting eroded away by these types of attacks. And whether it's with your payment systems or whether it's, a group that breaks into, let's say, a Sequoia, and is not really going after their portfolio company's IP, but is going after their LP's data because that's where the money comes from. And so, yeah, there's a lot that we can do, from an influence and an advice perspective. But again, at the end of the day, the fat part of the curve can't pay for the types of solutions that protect them against nation state attacks.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it does make me also think that, boy, if there are Duke entrepreneurs and folks who want to go into cybersecurity, if you can help attack some of this supply chain problem of understanding how vendors, whether they're actually practicing sufficient cybersecurity practices themselves and how you can efficiently review for that, I think you want to contact Chris Steed right away and talk about potentially how to start that company. There's a lot there that to go after. Let me keep going to student questions. Olivia.
Hi, thanks so much for speaking with us. I was wondering, so as cybersecurity companies are definitely seeing inflated valuations in their fundraising, I was wondering if your company is looking to take on these investments, even though that the valuations are too high, or would you rather take on a mid-tier company with a more grounded valuation?
So for us, we're more focused on that venture-like return. We're getting in early. We're looking at driving up those valuations, and where the really interesting thing lies with our investment philosophy is you tend to see valuations actually trending to fundamentals. And a lot of the reason why is we do spend 12, 18, 24 months developing these companies before they go out for later rounds of financing. We're very conservative in our approach. Early stage companies, underinvested ecosystems, groups of individuals that are not known by the commercial sector, that are coming out of government with a certain area of expertise for the first time. When we try to jump in at realistic levels. Seed and Series A generally equates 25 to 30%, to 35% ownership of those companies. So whatever number we invest, would generally reflect that. But as we looked at, this overinflated valuation ecosystem, we tend to continue to model to fundamentals. A lot of our companies, just by way of how they operate and how they look at volume-based selling and things like that, they do have the fundamentals to support these valuations. Now, I'll say, we've got an anti-portfolio. We saw FireEye when it was less than $1 million of revenue, going out for their Series A at $100 million valuation. Should we have invested then? Probably. Did we invest? Absolutely not. That's ridiculous. Palantir, same thing. Should we have invested then? We saw that when it was zero. And then they were raising at $125 million valuation. And so we tend to not chase valuations, but we will certainly take advantage of them on the way up, especially if it puts an amount of cash on the balance sheet in order to get to that end goal. I mean, we really model ourselves against time. And so we're careful that we don't overvalue ourselves from a fundamental standpoint. We take both that as well as third parties into account when we determine the valuation of these companies. And, again, valuation is more of an art than a science, but it's ultimately comes down to what the market is willing to pay. And if the market is willing to pay a high number and put a lot of money into that company, that's what we've got to go towards in order to continue to grow it.
Thank you.
Now, Chris, I want to move to a question from one of your fellow Duke alums, Ines.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. I'm just curious, how do you balance as a company the need for financial returns along with that thesis that you have of helping the world, right? Helping the country be stronger and have a better security posture with a variety of security use cases? I know you said dual use, but even within that, on the private sector side, from small businesses to enterprises, people might need different things and in different formats. And how do you consider those use cases along with some of the government use cases as you think about a company and really, from this conversation, help them grow into an actual company with a product offering?
Yeah, absolutely. And I go back to the vast majority of the traction that our companies get, the revenue and the returns, they really do come from that commercial side of the aisle. I mean, that's the lowest hanging fruit, and so when most companies do ask us, should I be dual use now at the earliest stages? I mean, we really do tell them no. Stay away from that ecosystem. Let us try to take that operational burden off of your shoulders, so that you can continue to subsist, either off of government revenue or that dual use plan. When it comes to doing good and making a buck, patience is a virtue. And so a lot of these entrepreneurs, a lot of these individuals that come to the table wanting to build these solutions, they want to change the world in a day. And what they find more often than not, it takes 2, 3, 4 years to get themselves implemented into an environment. And what we're seeing now, right along the lines of what you're talking about, is those individuals, those IT security professionals, I mean, some of the best in the world, they're now leaving the commercial environment, where they're getting paid $500,000 to $1 million a year because of how sophisticated they are. They're leaving that, coming over to government, starting companies in order to serve government, in order to support innovation, because they see us losing. They see that there's gaps in these ecosystems. And so we're beginning to see that shift from we're just in this to make a bunch of money inside of cybersecurity to we have to help the country. And in doing so, we're actually going to make a buck doing it. And so I've got one company right now that is doing just that. It's a group of individuals that stood up one of the largest antivirus companies in the world. They came over to the government side of the aisle to build solutions from an attack mindset. This is how I would break in, are now developing highly scalable solutions in that environment. And by way of those learnings, they're now bringing commercial grade solutions back into that commercial ecosystem. And so as we've gone from government off the shelf to commercial off the shelf, we're looking for those entrepreneurs that want to work with both sides of the aisle, because they see themselves as more informed. They see themselves as part of a special community that is out there fighting the fight, not just inside of commercial networks, but on behalf of the U.S. government with those types of authorities. And so, that's a lot of what we see occurring now. We want to see more of it, because that passion is what translates into long-term value creation. And there's not only jobs attached to this, but there truly is something good and a buck to be made here.
Thank you so much.
Jenny.
Mr. Steed, thank you so much for your time this evening. This has been a fascinating guest lecture for me. I'm a fellow here at Duke with over 20 years of experience in national security. I am researching quantum computing and its implications on cryptology. And I'm curious what trends you might be seeing along the quantum computing investment.
Absolutely. So we are seeing a whole lot more interest in quantum encryption than we are seeing in quantum enablement, at least at the venture capital level. In terms of enabling quantum computing, it's for us from an outsider looking in, it's sort of like a black hole. You're going to continue to fund until it gets enabled. That's more of a government function. That's more of a strategic integrator function. Those are research dollars that come out of national labs or universities. Where we see a lot of the environment going is towards this quantum encryption model, where it is at least protected against quantum-based attacks. Now, theoretically, because we don't have quantum computing yet, you can't really have quantum-based attacks, and therefore don't require quantum-based encryption. But that world is coming. And so we are stepping very lightly into that area, trying to look at first the encryption side of the aisle, because again, the enablement piece is hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. And for us, at that early stage level, we're still not looking at that commercialization side. I mean, it really still is, more on that academic, more on the national security, more on that government side of the aisle. And so we depend upon those technologies to be enabled. And then we assume that there's going to be applications developed off of it. We're looking at a few of those right now, particularly in and around, how you could conceptualize two things existing essentially in the same state at the same time in two different places, but really only coming from a common source. You can almost envision the blockchain or things like that as being somewhat equivalent, but we continue to look at the space. It's a hard one from a venture capital perspective. We fully expect quantum to be unleashed at one point, but it's really that quantum encryption or the quantum resistant encryption that we see getting a lot of investment dollars today.
Great, thank you.
Samantha.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. I'm in Professor Hoffman's class, and we've talked a lot about how collaboration and information sharing might be able to kind of drive innovation. But I'm curious if you've seen cybersecurity companies willing to collaborate with each other, or if they're kind of more likely to keep their solutions to themselves in order to hopefully profit off of them.
It's a great question. And by way of customers wanting to move away from buying 20 products from 20 different vendors to buying 20 products from a single vendor, we're seeing a lot more collaboration between cybersecurity companies, where they want to create APIs. They want to be integrated into managed security services solutions or managed detection and response solutions. And so, from a collaboration perspective, it's one thing to be, let's say, a cyber threat intelligence company that has lookout posts in this set of domains on the deep and the dark web. It's another thing to be able to stream real time YARA rules, which are essentially cybersecurity rules to try to detect certain types of breaches, particularly applied to phishing, but to take a set of YARA rules and then apply them to VirusTotal, send them into VirusTotal so that everybody's systems upgrade at the same time. And so we're seeing more and more of that collaborative sharing environments. We've invested in cyber threat intelligence platforms to try to facilitate all these different intelligence sources, give you a single picture, then make it something that you can actually use. But it just has to occur. We see industry working groups. A lot of them are facilitated, by way of NGOs as well as government organizations like the FSISAC community. Those financial services, energy groups. It's a set of chief information security officers, chief information officers that get together and talk about these problems. And so that collaboration needs to continue. If you're not collaborating, you better have $1 billion in your bank account, because it's really hard to go it alone.
Thank you so much.
Chris, Daniel asked a question by chat that I will ask for him. When you're looking at hiring folks into Paladin to help you guys with your investments, how many folks are you looking to hire that have deep computer science expertise?
We love computer science backgrounds for individuals inside of a venture firm to be successful. You've got to be a self-starter. You just have to come in. You have to have that passion. You have to want to look at something that is of interest to you, and you've got to learn to fail. I attended a conference, I want to say about 8 years ago, and one of the individuals was one of the leading venture capitalists out in New York at the time. And he said to me, or said to an entire conference, and then again personally afterwards, that it takes about 10 years for you to experience actual real carried interest, from when you invest in a company to when you actually exit a company and truly share in that investment interest. And so I didn't believe it at the time. I was 5 years in. I figured, okay, this is going to come, hopefully faster. I hope I'm smart. We'll see what happens. And lo and behold, it took about 10 years for me to actually experience that. And so when you do come in, computer science is important. But it really does come down to how you connect with that individual. You can learn, those technologies down at the root level, but how do you grow that business? How do you help this person through a personal problem in order that they're able to focus on that business? How do you perform the function of operating in the best interest of the company, best interest of the shareholders? There's just so much that goes into it. And so, from a venture capital perspective, there's so many different backgrounds that have been successful. One of the unique things about Paladin is that we throw these different backgrounds sort of into the arena and just let them fight it out. I come at this from a financial background and a political background. You've got individuals that come at it from a national security background. We have an individual who was previously deputy director of DARPA, so literally wrote billion-dollar checks for submarines that will come in and fight it out. And those are the things that really stimulate the type of investments that we do. And and that's what drives us, is to be able to get into those conversations, express yourself, be that self-starter, take an opinion, take a hard line on that opinion, learn everything about that market. Because again, 70% more, or more than 70% of the deals that we do are ones where we develop a thesis and then we go out and find the right company that fills that thesis.
Because what I love about that also is it makes me think of a lot of the things that Walter Isaacson has written about, where he's saying, look, when you have people who have diverse backgrounds, and then where you can create an environment where their ideas bump up against each other, that's where you're going to find innovation. And it sounds like, to a large degree, that's what Silicon Valley was for a long time. And it sounds like that's what you're creating at Paladin, which is really exciting. I've got one more student question, and then I have a last question for you. Kathleen's question is around the growing trend around social impact investing, and particularly with a focus on environmentally conscious investing, and wondering if you see much of that at Paladin, and whether you guys have done any looking specifically for companies that are taking an environmentally conscious approach to cybersecurity and the problems that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, ESG is top of mind these days. We think about diversity. We think about environmentally conscious investment decisions. By way of our national security focus and our dual use focus, things like environmental technologies and clean technologies, have always been a part of what we look at and what we can look at. What we really do believe is, when we look at strengthening cyberspace, we're strengthening, our ability to innovate. The moment that, let's say 5 or 10 years from now, organizations don't buy Microsoft because it was built in the United States is something that we're trying to stop from occurring. And so those are a lot of the first principles that we go back to, when we evaluate these technologies and having a social impact. And so, when we do, look at that from that lens, that dual use aspect comes roaring back into play. We invested in companies that were acquired and now are your standard stand-up scanning technologies when you go into the airport. We've invested in companies that used to instill and embed silver ions into everyday things because it could kill viruses and kill bacteria. So much of what we try to do and what we try to focus on is social impact investing. One of the things about social impact investing in the past, is you see a lot of development capital, and that development capital just stays as such. There's no ROI on it. And so we really look at saying that this is not development capital. This is economic development that you can also make money on. And so that's really where we try to gravitate to in our ESG message. And, we feel we've got a very strong one. And when you look at the profile of our companies, we've got a company, I think I mentioned as Ursa Space Systems. By design, they were built to be 50% male and 50% female. And right now, their top 3 executives, 2 out of 3 are female executives. And this is a high technology space tech company. And so those are the things that we try to gravitate to. The models that are coming to bear here, are saying that diversity, these different ideas, ESG, it's important and you can make money on it, but you have to be really focused on it, and so that's a big part of our legacy. 20 years we've been doing this, and, we're really looking forward to, celebrating our 20th anniversary coming up in about 2 weeks.
Well, and it sounds like already planning to celebrate your 30th when the 10 years are going to go past for the companies you're investing now. Chris, in line with that and in line with thinking about your future workforce, one of the things that's, I think, very daunting for a lot of students at Duke, I don't know if it was this way when you went there, is there's so many things that they can choose from to do. And we've really increased that. The number of technology, law and policy and straight technology offerings that we have now at Duke give students a tremendous ability to do a bunch of things. And they have to be very choiceful about where they're going to invest their time. And I'm wondering, what would you recommend to students who are starting at Duke, either at an undergraduate or at a graduate level, to where to invest their time to make the biggest impact if they want to be doing what you're doing now in 20 years?
David, it's something I think about a lot, because we are looking at a massive demographic shift, not only in this country but other countries. Where you have a group of individuals that not only want to make an impact on the world, but have learned from the very ground up how technology has been built, how technology is used, and it has become an inherent part of their lives. And so, the biggest advice I can give, is talk to everybody, learn everything, really try to, better understand, some of the areas that you can be involved in, because when you look at cybersecurity, it can be a big gray blob at times. But for most people, when it comes to cybersecurity, they think, I don't have a technology background, I don't have a computer science major, therefore I can't participate. Well, the vast majority of computer science jobs are not on the technical side of the aisle. And a general counsel that knows more about cybersecurity is vastly more valuable than someone that doesn't. A chief information security officer that understands the policy side of the aisle or understands the government side of the aisle is vastly more valuable than someone that doesn't. and so having those skills and really looking at cybersecurity is not, again, cybersecurity, but security in the cyber age. It's a cyber science. There are so many interdisciplinary areas that this touches, that you can be an economist that specializes in cyber and understanding how cyberspace impacts governments, understanding the various different levers of power, and so, my biggest word of advice is, disavow yourselves of the concept that you must be a technologist, you must be a computer scientist to have an impact on this industry, because the vast majority don't.
That's fantastic. And I think one of the things I love so much about that answer, Chris, is when I look at Duke's competitive advantage, and one of the great things that it provides students is that interdisciplinary approach and the collaboration that's going on between the business school and the law school and the public policy school and the computer science department and the Pratt School of Engineering and the humanities departments, and how much you learn from critical thinking and being able to read and write and think from taking classes across all of those disciplines and bringing those ideas together. I think it's incredibly powerful. Well, we're out of time. I am so incredibly grateful that you came. I think we could continue doing this for so long, and I'm probably going to hit you up to come in and join my cybersecurity and national security class in the fall. I'm really grateful for you taking the time. This has been fantastic.
No, absolutely, David. And, from your lips to, God's ears, on a lot of these points. I mean, we're all in this together. And, I look at Duke as, as a place that can really contribute to the mission as a whole. And so really appreciate the time, David.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending. And if any of you have other questions that you want to follow up, just send them to me and I can get them to Chris. Thank you all.
Thank you.